I am preaching this sermon in my tomato patch today because today's sermon, like last week's sermon, is based on a parable in which the planting of seeds drives the story. And in both parables, the seeds are sown, but the crop that comes up is not what the farmer wanted to see emerge from the ground. In last week's parable, a farmer sows good grain, but the crop is compromised when an enemy goes into the farmer's field and throws out a bunch of weed seeds, and the farmer has to sort out the weeds from the grain at the harvest. Well, today's parable is about a farmer who plants a mustard seed, and what grows is a tree instead of a mustard plant. Now, I like these parables, especially the mustard seed parable, because I am generally a terrible gardener, especially when it comes to tomatoes. I don't actually like to eat tomatoes raw, but I do like to cook with tomatoes, and so every year I try to plant tomatoes, and every year I get fairly solid-looking plants that yield about 2 tomatoes per plant if I'm lucky. I don't know what my problem is. Each year I have fantasies that involve salsa and endless bowls of gazpacho and pasta sauce for days. I'm even growing some basil just for my pasta sauce, which may or may not happen. I started these tomato plants from seeds, kind of on an impulse. I saw the seeds for sale at the supermarket, and I thought to myself, well, if I try to get tomatoes from seeds, I will probably fail before I even get the starts into the garden. It will save me a lot of heartache. So I planted seeds in about a dozen paper cups with soil from what used to be the compost pile in my backyard. Seeds germinated in 3 of those 12 cups, and now I have 3 tomato plants. So far, I have 3 tomatoes coming in. But I also have lots of blossoms, not that that necessarily means anything. Here is a photo I took after filming my Easter sermon. My apple tree was filled with blossoms on that day, and this photo was meant to be a photo of hope. I was going to have lots of apples in September. Here is a photo of exactly half of this year's apple crop already fallen from the tree, preparing to rot into the ground. So who knows if I'll be cooking mini tomatoes at the end of the summer, but what I do know is that, according to Jesus anyway, the kingdom of heaven happens when someone like me is in charge of planting seeds. Maybe there are too many weeds in the wheat, or maybe what comes up is not what was supposed to have been planted. Now I say this last part because in the parable of the mustard seed, Jesus says that a farmer goes out and plants a mustard seed, the smallest of seeds according to Jesus, and what grows up is a tree or a shrub big enough for birds' nests, which is to say that what grows up is not a mustard. I grew up believing that this was a parable about how in the kingdom of heaven, in the divine economy, that which is tiny can grow into something really big, such that even our meager efforts at faithfulness can yield outsized results. A mustard seed becomes a mustard tree. And I really like that message. In fact, that may be the message of the parable of the yeast, which follows the parable of the mustard seed in Matthew. It's a parable that also was read to us in the video that Kit made for us before the sermon video. The parable of the yeast seems to suggest that a small bit of leavening can cause the entire loaf to rise, and that's wonderful. It's just not the message of the parable of the mustard seed. I say this because there is no such thing as a mustard tree. Therefore, the parable of the mustard seed cannot be about a mustard seed becoming a mustard tree. Now, to be fair, actually there is a tree native to Palestine that in English and in Arabic sometimes is called a mustard tree. But Jesus spoke only Aramaic as far as we know, and the book of Matthew wasn't written in English or Arabic, it was written in Greek, and in the Greek, the word used here can only mean mustard, a plant that was cultivated throughout the Mediterranean world in Jesus' time. And as with people today, folks then ate the greens and ground up the seeds for flavoring. And mustard can get tall enough. I mean, there's feral mustard growing all over the Salinas Valley and the Santa Clara Valley, places I lived before coming to Oakland. And I've seen mustard grow to be 6 feet tall or more. It's just that mustard is not a tree. So in the parable, Jesus says a farmer goes out and plants a seed and then expects mustard. But instead, what comes up is some kind of tree, an olive tree perhaps. Here's a photo of my olive tree. It has maybe 5 olives on it this year. The message I take away from the parable of the mustard seed is this: in the kingdom of heaven, things are unpredictable. The divine economy is filled with surprises, and that can be bad news, or at least it can be challenging news if you're the kind of person who really needs to be in control of everything. If you need to know exactly which plant will come up, if you need to be in control of what is mustard and what is some kind of volunteer tree, if you need for your garden to serve only you and not provide nesting space for the birds of the air, then this is a hard message. And by the way, I'm not knocking the value of having control over one's life. Sometimes not being in control can feel terrifying, and sometimes it's downright dangerous. The message from the parable of the mustard seed, it's not always an easy message. In fact, I'd say that that's probably true of a lot of Jesus' teachings. If we really take them apart and put them back together and then test them against real life, they can be difficult and challenging. But the more I live, the more I feel as if I have almost no control over any of it. Now, this may just be the COVID-19 shelter and social isolation speaking now, but I had all sorts of plans for this summer and the year, and these aren't happening anytime soon, if at all. And probably so do you. I have a great niece who was born in June, and for all I know, she'll be riding a unicycle before I get to meet her in person. None of this is what we wanted. None of this is what we planned for. Yet still, we have the promise of the parable of the mustard seed. In the kingdom of heaven, in the divine economy, just because something is unexpected or unplanned for or surprising, that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. In the polity of holiness, even the disappointments of a bad gardener can be miraculous. Even life in quarantine can render surprising joy. That is the promise of the kingdom of heaven. No surprise, not even disappointment, can hold back the creative and compassionate and gracious love of God. Now, sometimes you have to look for it. Sometimes living in the kingdom of heaven, the realm of love, means we have to do the difficult and sometimes tedious work of finding the places where God surprises us. But that work is always good work. So, dearly beloved, look for the God of bad gardeners. Look for the one who surprises us by causing the seeds we plant to germinate into a crop we did not expect. And take comfort knowing that this is part of God's redemptive work in the world, especially in these uncertain days when redemption seems so hard to come by. And naturally, I hope these tomato plants will yield more caprese and pico de gallo than my family can possibly eat. But even if that doesn't happen, it won't change the fact that God is alive in my garden and in the world, working wonders that will yet surprise and delight. May it be so. Amen.